Welcome back to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're discussing John Murawski's latest investigation into civics education as it makes a comeback. Civics is now described as the most contested subject in schools. For years, there's been a move towards STEM and social justice, but civics is stepping back into the classroom. Now, the fight isn't just about facts, but about the meaning of America itself, whether it's a land of opportunity or a nation defined by privilege and oppression. Federal officials passed on $1 billion plan to fund civics education under Biden in 2022. That left civics education up to the states, local districts, and nonprofits. Today, more than half the states have some kind of civics requirement. 28 require assessments and 14 use a U.S. citizenship test. Just this summer, lawmakers in 45 states debated nearly 200 civics bills. A major player in the civics revolution is the Jack Miller Center. With a network of 1,300 scholars, the group is training teachers and helping universities build new civics schools. Their approach focuses on primary sources, voices ranging from Aristotle and Lincoln to Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Nikole Hannah-Jones, and even poet Amanda Gorman. The center's mission is to provide a, quote, synthesis of both perspectives, avoiding the extremes of cynicism and nostalgia that reduce the nation's history to tropes and caricatures. The civics revolution is being seen in both K-12 education and at the university or graduate level. All of this coming against the backdrop of alarm over declining civic literacy. One 2021 report warns that the world's oldest constitutional democracy is in grave danger. Now, supporters are hoping that this new civics push, grounded in debate, history, and diverse perspectives, will turn the tide. But there is still debate over whether it is included in some classrooms. We're joined now by the lead investigator on this story, John Murawski. John, thank you so much for speaking with me.
I'm glad to be here.
So this isn't the first discussion we've had regarding the rise in civics education. We spoke earlier this summer about the changes going on at the university level. Is this an extension of the interest in civics that we're already seeing?
Yeah, it's basically just another variant of the same theme. These are university professors who receive some civics training from the Jack Miller Center, and they're training high school and middle school teachers. So they have the articles about the Jack Miller Center as one facet of the civics movement, and they have a particular way of training professors to introduce them to civics, and then the professors then offer classes, typically like 2, 3, 4, 5 day long immersion, like seminars, discussion seminars for the high school and middle school teachers. And this approach involves there are two elements to it. One is you go back to founding documents and original documents. You're not reading a textbook, or you're not reading somebody else's analysis. You're reading the original documents, and it's also involves a close reading of the documents, not just a quick scan. Close reading and a discussion down at the like subatomic level of granularity, looking at individual words, context. And so that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is the introduction of texts that previously wouldn't have been part of the civics canon. Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois. In one of these classes, the Jack Miller Center included an essay from the New York Times 1619 Project. Amanda Gorman, the poet who read at Biden's inauguration. These aren't really founding documents, but it's part of the discussion and debate as to what is the meaning of the United States, what is the United States, and it is a perspective that's that gained so much traction, particularly on the left, that the civics movement has to somehow account for. It has to include it as a part of this debate now of what the United States is. It's no longer a fringe opinion, I guess, at this point, and they have to account for it. So they include it in the readings and they discuss it. Now, I am sure that the discussion of the 1619 Project in a civics class is going to be different than the way it would be in an African American studies class. I assume that in an African American studies class, that discussion will be much more, I would say, reverential toward the posture of the 1619 Project. And in a civics class, it would be more, I think it would be more open to a critique of some of the assumptions, rhetoric, and, it would be, I don't think it would be necessarily like a denunciation, but it would be more of a little more skeptical.
And it seems like there's a general kind of talking about critiquing with regards to even what the founding fathers did. And in your piece, it was talking about, what is the real goal of civics revival? Is it to instill a more traditional patriotic worldview, or is it to equip students with the ability to critique and then debate competing visions of, what we did right or wrong within our nation. Why do you think this is important to get into the K-12 education? And also, do you think that this could deepen the divide in our nation, or do you think it would bring people together studying civics?
So I think you asked me like 5 or 6 questions. So let me try to answer some of them. And if I don't answer all of them, just ask the question again. But generally speaking, in the civics world, there is a constant state of panic that Americans are not sufficiently familiar with our traditions of government, politics, or the founding philosophy that gave rise to the country, which is essentially kind of like an Enlightenment rationalism. And so the idea is that people that students are not being exposed to the documents, but they're being exposed to highly critical interpretations of the documents, or the topic is completely ignored for fear of controversy. The teachers want to avoid controversy, so the topic is just skimmed over, ignored, and so people are not really trained. In a democratic republic, citizens have to have some kind of basic training in participatory democracy. So if people are completely ignorant, it is harmful or devastating, destructive to democracy. So the idea is to address this topic in a way that to try to de-escalate the partisanship by going back to these original documents and looking at these documents in a calm and rationalistic way. What were the founders trying to achieve? What were the problems they were trying to solve? What were the solutions that were proposed? What were the debates at the time? Whose side won the debate? How are these issues still relevant in the present day? So to try to address it that way. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
no. Why do you think they're trying to really do this within K-12 as well? Because obviously we've spoken about it at the university level and at the graduate level. Why is this type of education so important in the younger generation?
Well, because, that's where you get in high school, most people don't go to college, right? It's only a minority of people who go to college. So if you're going to educate people in the basics of citizenship, which is civics, the rights and duties of citizenship, if you wait until college, and only college graduates would have that exposure, and only college graduates really in the humanities, because people in STEM don't have unless they're taking they have a special interest and they're taking electives, they really could skip all those classes. So the question is, there's some universities, I think, in some school districts are making it mandatory to study some kind of civics, but some of it's not very deep. Some of it's more like a citizenship test. You would have to basically be able to answer same kinds of questions you would answer on a citizenship test, but it doesn't go very deep. The problem is the topic is inherently controversial, and school boards don't want to court controversy unnecessarily. You don't want parents to start a letter writing campaign or some kind of online campaign against the teacher or against the school. And people just don't have this. If they're out to educate you, but you don't want to be educated, you're going to resist, then the school district will just basically ease up and tone down the material to avoid controversy. And in some case, and the essence of America's founding has become, and the nation, and like the essence of the nation itself, is essentially a flashpoint for controversy at this time in our country's history. So there's just no consensus on what the United States means, what's supposed to be. Are we supposed to have equal treatment of citizens with color blindness, or are we supposed to treat people consciously and specifically with regard to their gender identity and their racial identity? What kind of policies should we have in place? So civics, it's not easy to do, but if the idea is you can introduce these ideas and present a diversity of viewpoints on these topics, written by original sources, by looking at primary source documents, then you can engage students in a discussion that's rational and calm. The thing is that you are reading documents written in the 1700s and 1800s. Not every middle school student is equipped to read those kinds of documents and understand them. Even in high school, I would have found it pretty challenging. And even now, I think even the teachers who read these documents, so what happens in a Jack Miller, I should tell you what happens in a Jack Miller Center workshop is they send the teachers a a curated anthology of readings, which could be anywhere from 200 to 400 pages. And those teachers have to read the whole thing because they're going to be discussing everything in that anthology. And so they have to read it, and they have to understand that, and not just skim it, but actually read it, annotate it, and be able to just come to these sessions, 8 hours a day, and be ready to discuss. So you can't, fall asleep in the middle. You have to be attentive and alert, and you have to be prepared. So it's not even every high school teacher is willing to go through that level of commitment. So I think one of the probably challenges is the Jack Miller approach is it is very intensive and it's very intellectual. It's not for slackers. It's not for people who have a casual interest. So, but they will, by the end of this year, they will have trained 4,000 high school and middle school teachers since, I believe, is it 2016? It's like in a decade, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they're taking the best approach, to maybe bridge the gap of an education that has struggled to gain bipartisan support. And it makes you wonder, is it because the subject carries certain political connotations nowadays? Is it about who's been championing it? I mean, I wonder why, when I hear what the Jack Miller Center is doing, it sounds like it's getting a very good variety of viewpoints. So it makes you wonder, is it just the difficulty in which the approach that they're taking that's turning people off? Or is it just these connotations that come along with civics education?
Well, the progressives distrust civics. They believe it's a right-wing Trojan horse to introduce knee-jerk patriotism and to basically exclude critique and present a kind of Republican view of the world. I think that's an oversimplification, but it's not like it's totally off base. But I think it's a gross oversimplification. These civics, I think in the current iteration, civics is trying to expand the range of documents and sources that you're reading. But their goal is ultimately a goal that is it is a patriotic goal to instill a certain degree of admiration and respect for the nation's founding and its traditions. Whereas I think the leftist approach would be to instill distrust, if not outright hostility, towards the nation's founding and its traditions, and to Western civilization in general as a negative negative in the annals of human affairs. Essentially, a destructive, harmful tragedy that happened in the last 500 years through Western expansion. Because it does involve, you can call it genocide, but I mean there are entire populations that no longer exist. So it's not clear to me they would exist today if it wasn't for the West. There was genocide among indigenous people too.
I mean, yeah,
I've seen snaps.
No, can you keep going? Sorry.
Yeah. No, sometimes you'll see these maps on Facebook. Like my progressive friends will post these maps. Here's what the country would look like if Europeans hadn't settled the United States. And so the Cherokees are here, the Apaches are here, the Lenni Lenape are here, as if nothing would have changed from the year 1600. They would have stayed exactly in place, and their boundaries would have been respected. There would have been no war, no conquest, no extermination. So it's a kind of very naive view, but it is common among, in a sense, if you could say that the right is overly nostalgic and patriotic about the United States, you can say the left is overly nostalgic and idealistic over indigenous people. And anybody who has, a tan complexion or darker, they immediately, genuflect to these cultures uncritically, which is almost comical if you're an outsider looking in. But there is a sort of this, unthinking reverence for anything that's not European. And that's, I think, too common. So I think you could say both sides tend to have an overly reverential posture to their own tribe. But in civics, what you're seeing here in this latest iteration of civics is an expansion of the Overton window and an inclusion of documents. So you're reading abolitionists, but you're also reading John Calhoun, who was, I think he was the governor, the senator from South Carolina. He was like one of the primary orators of the pre-Civil War era for slavery. So you're hearing these arguments from the sources themselves, how they framed these arguments, what facts they cited, how they understood reality. And I don't see how that could be harmful to anybody. I think that could only be beneficial, unless, you have teachers who teach it in a bad way. But if the teachers teach it in an open-ended kind of manner, as the as I understand that they do, I think that it will be to everybody's benefit. So I had a very favorable impression of what the Jack Miller Center was doing. But it ultimately depends on what these individual K-12 teachers, how they're doing it in their own classroom. They're under some restrictions. They have time restrictions. They have, their school board has specific learning goals. Their state has educational goals. So they can't just transport en masse the entire Jack Miller Center project into their classroom, right? They have to adapt it. But the general idea, I think, would be to everyone's benefit. My sense is that people on the progressive left are threatened by it because they see that it encroaches on their territory. It covers some of the same documents, but maybe from a different perspective. And I think one of the things that I find, I was actually just talking with a friend about, who's a Democrat, a typical liberal guy, he's in his 50s, and we were talking about land acknowledgements, and I was just exchanging some thoughts about land acknowledgements, and he said to me, if you hadn't pointed out to me why land acknowledgements are controversial, or why anybody would find them controversial, I would just think it's just being kind. Like, why wouldn't you want to be kind? Like, I wouldn't understand that if you look at it a little deeper, that there's a controversy involved here that people should be aware of. So I think what Civics does is to some degree introduce founding documents from the left, but in a way that opens up the possibility to be skeptical about these documents, or to have the ability for teachers and students to understand them to have more of an ambiguous or ambivalent attitude, not ambiguous, more of an ambivalent attitude. You don't have to revere these documents. You may, if you wish, if you choose, but it's not obligatory. And I don't think in a African American studies class, you could study these documents in any way other than in a very, I would say, I've never taken these classes, but my sense is I've seen papers and, yeah.
So do you think that this should be done apart from federal interference? Like, obviously, there wasn't that money that went towards it in 2022. Do you think this should be down to the state and local levels to be making the decisions?
That's the way our country is set up. The federal government doesn't dictate high school K-12 curriculum or curricula. But what the federal government does through the Department of Education, it can give money to these school districts or give money to states, and the money comes with strings attached. And then, although you're not dictating what is to be taught, once there's federal funding, you have an influence as to how the funding is spent. Right. This is the reason Donald Trump can withhold federal funding from Harvard or Columbia. Right. So Donald Trump can't dictate what Harvard teaches, but Donald Trump can say that as long as we're giving you federal funding, we have some say as to how this money is used.
What do you think people should have? What are the greatest takeaways that people should have from your latest report and just the civics movement in general?
Yeah, I mean, I basically would say that when you read mainstream media articles about civics, generally these articles are structured in such a way as to unmask the true intent of civics, which is right-wing propaganda. It appears innocuous, but it's really right-wing propaganda. So, but these articles, so will never actually tell you what is taught in a class, what actually the content of the class is. What they look at is who's funding it. Or they're looking for some connection. Well, so-and-so homeschools his kids, or so-and-so is a Christian. And they're looking for these, it's almost like done by innuendo. But if you actually look at what's taught in the class, it's pretty harmless. And most people would find it intellectually engaging and interesting. So there's a lot of propaganda about civics. I like to think in my article is not propaganda, that I'm just giving you a more, objective sense as to what actually happens in an actual class and what the actual text that you read and the subjects that you cover. So yeah, I would say the takeaway is a lot of what you read about civics in the mainstream media is it's skeptical to the point of cynicism, and it distorts the reality.
Excuse me, sorry about that. Well, John, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.